July 1572. The southern horizon does not darken with clouds, but with dust, an endless rolling wall of dust rising from the steppe like the breath of some ancient beast. At first it looks like a storm, but storms do not shimmer with steel. Storms do not scream in 100 tongues. Storms do not carry banners, point 120,000 riders advance toward the heart of Russia. The earth trembles long before the first scouts return. Hooves pound in a rhythm that feels almost mechanical, like the beating of a colossal war drum. Metal clashes against metal. Arrows rattle in leather quivers. War cries cut through the wind. It is not just an army moving north. It is memory returning. It is vengeance riding in formation. Moscow still smells of smoke. Only 1 year earlier, in 1571, that same horde had reduced the Russian capital to a furnace. Suburbs of wood and tar had ignited like dry straw. The fire had leapt from roof to roof faster than men could run. Mothers had thrown children from windows to spare them the flames. Fathers had tried to fight smoke with buckets. The wind had chosen a side that day, and it had not chosen Russia. 80,000 dead. Others dragged away in chains. Slaves marched south in endless columns, bound for markets beyond the Black Sea. When the smoke cleared, only the stone Kremlin remained standing, an island of pale walls and a sea of blackened ruin. And now the horde has returned. Its head rides Devlet Giry, Khan of Crimea, heir to the legacy of the Golden Horde, vassal to the vast and confident Ottoman Empire. He does not come for tribute. He does not come to negotiate. He comes to erase. Russian spies bring word that freezes the blood in Moscow's rebuilt streets. This is the largest army the Horde has assembled in generations. Elite mounted archers who can fire at full gallop without losing aim. Lancers hardened by wars from Poland to Persia. Ottoman janissaries with disciplined musket fire. Bronze cannons cast in the foundries of Constantinople. It is not a raid. It is a campaign of extermination in the capital. Fear moves faster than any rider. Priests chant without pause. Women hide icons beneath floorboards. Blacksmiths hammer through the night. Soldiers sharpen blades that feel too light in their trembling hands. Everyone knows the stories. When the Horde decides to make an example, nothing survives. Not stone, not grain, not memory. But inside the Kremlin, one man does not tremble. Ivan IV stands beneath vaulted ceilings blackened by last year's smoke. History will call him Ivan the Terrible, and not without reason. He has known humiliation, betrayal, poison, rebellion. He has ruled with terror and brilliance in equal measure. And now he understands something most of his enemies do not, that he's been waiting. Because this time, he has a plan that he knows he cannot match 120,000 riders in open field. Russian cavalry cannot outmaneuver the steppe. Russian infantry cannot chase arrows through grasslands that stretch beyond sight. To fight the Horde on its terms is to he will not fight on their terms. All winter after Moscow burned, while snow buried charred beams and frozen corpses, carpenters worked behind guarded walls. Timber was cut in staggering quantities. Iron was hammered into brackets and plates. Wheels were reinforced. Loopholes were carved at precise heights. They built something new, something strange, something the Horde had never faced at this scale. The GULIER GAR, the walking city. Imagine walls 3 meters high, assembled from massive wooden sections, each mounted on wheels or sleds. Each panel thick enough to swallow arrows. Each fitted with narrow openings designed for muskets and small cannons. When locked together, they form a mobile fortress stretching nearly a kilometer in length. A wooden spine bristling with fire. Inside it, thousands of musketeers can fire while protected. Small cannons, falconets, can blast grapeshot into charging lines. Cavalry can pass through gates and vanish back into safety. It is not elegant. It is not glorious. It is brutally practical. Where the Horde needs movement, it will find walls. Where the Horde needs panic, it will find discipline. Where the Horde expects flight, it will find fire. Ivan appoints Prince Mikhail Vorotensky to command. A veteran who has studied Mongol tactics not from books, but from captivity. A man who understands that nomadic cavalry lives on space and fear. Remove space. Remove fear. You remove their advantage. The chosen ground lies near the village of Melody, south of Moscow. Rivers cut through the land. Forests tighten the flanks. Hills offer elevation for artillery. It is not an obvious fortress. It is not impregnable. It is perfect. Voritinsky drills his men relentlessly. Assemble the walls. Lock the wheels. Fire. Reload. Fire again. No pursuit. No heroics. No breaking formation. 25,000 men. That is all Russia can gather. Against 120,000, the numbers would make any rational commander surrender. But Voritinsky understands something deeper than numbers. A charging horse can kill a man, but a wall of wood and iron can kill a horse. And without horses, the horde is only flesh. As summer ripens, scouts return breathless. The horde has crossed the frontier. Village burn. Refugees clog the roads north. The dust cloud grows thicker by the day. Ivan visits the camp one final time. He walks among soldiers who know many of them will never see autumn. He does not shout. He does not promise glory, that he says only this: behind us is Moscow. Behind Moscow are our families. There is nowhere else to go. The men nod. Far to the south, Devlet Jiri smiles as he rides. He believes he is marching toward another easy triumph. Another city in flames. Another czar humiliated. He has Ottoman guns. He has veteran warriors. He has numbers no Russian army can withstand. He does not yet understand that he is riding toward a trap designed not merely to repel him, but to break him. By the end of July, the dust cloud reaches the Oka River. The horde is coming, and this time, Russia is not running. The first clash does not begin with a roared. It begins with silence. Dawn breaks heavy and humid over the fields near Melody. A thin mist clings to the low ground, curling between the riverbanks and the shallow hills. Russian soldiers have been awake all night. No one slept. They heard it in the dark, the distant thunder that never quite fades. Now they see it. The southern horizon moves. First, it seems like the land itself is shifting, like a dark tide rolling forward. Then shapes sharpen, banners ripple. Sunlight flashes off spearheads and helmets. The horde spreads across the plain in terrifying breadth. Wave after wave of mounted riders, stretching farther than the eye can measure. 120,000. The ground vibrates beneath Russian boots. Prince Voritinsky stands behind the long wooden spine of the Gulier Gar. The fortress stretches nearly a kilometer, sections locked wheel to wheel, loopholes aligned like the slits of a colossal mechanical beast. Cannons rest on elevated platforms. Musketeers wait behind timber thick enough to swallow arrows, that he does not shout. He raises one hand. 2 kilometers to the south, the Russian vanguard waits. 3,000 cavalry, Russians and Cossacks, positioned deliberately in open ground. They look exposed, vulnerable, exactly as planned. The first Tatar scouts approach cautiously. 10,000 light riders spread in a crescent, bows ready, testing distance. They circle, observing the Russian cavalry. Then, without warning, they charge. It is like watching a storm surge forward. Arrows rise in black arcs, hissing through the air. Russian cavalry answer with mounted muskets. Smoke bursts from their line. Several Tatars tumble from saddles. Horses collapse mid-stride. And then, just as quickly the Russians turn, they flee. The horde, it is familiar. Predictable. Cowardice. Devlet Jiri, watching from behind the forward elements, feels the warm satisfaction of inevitability. The Russians always break. The Russians always run. This will be over before sunset. The Tatar vanguard pursues at full gallop. They do not slow until they crest a slight rise, and suddenly see it. The wall, the Gulier Gar, stands revealed in full scale, its wooden sections forming a continuous barrier bristling with black cannon mouths and musket barrels protruding from narrow slits. Behind it, disciplined ranks wait in silence. The retreating Russian cavalry disappears through gates that slam shut behind them. The Tatars are still charging when the order is given. Fire. The wall explodes in smoke. Thousands of muskets discharge at once. Falconets roar. Grape shot tears through the tightly packed riders. The first line of totters simply vanishes, horses flipping violently, bodies torn apart mid-gallop. The second line crashes into the fallen. Arrows released too late. Most striking wood, thudding harmlessly into reinforced planks. The horde pulls back in shock. More than 200 riders lie dead in less than a minute. For the first time, confusion ripples through the Tatar ranks. They have never seen such a thing. A fortress that appears in open field, a defensive line that moves and assembles where needed. Devlet rides forward to see it himself. He studies the structure from a distance. Forests guard the flanks. The Pakra River anchors the rear. The wall is thick, modular, designed not as a city fortification, but as a weapon that he does not hesitate long, that he has numbers. He has momentum. He has broken armies twice this size before. Wood burns. Men tire. Walls fall down. He orders a full assault before dusk. 10,000 riders prepare in successive waves. War drums beat. Horns sound. The horde stretches wide and begins to move as one massive body. The first wave charges at full gallop, arrows darkening the sky. They ride closer this time, spreading slightly, trying to avoid dense clustering. Arrows slam into the Gulier Gar. Some find loopholes, striking defenders who fall backward without sound. But most arrows bury themselves uselessly in timber. 50 meters. The Russian line waits. 30 meters. Fire. The blast is even more devastating than before. Muskets discharge in disciplined volleys. Cannons fire grape shot directly into the charging mass. Horses collapse in chains, tripping those behind them. Riders scream as iron tears through flesh and bone. The second wave attempts to ride around the flanks, only to encounter marshy ground and tree lines that break their formation. They are forced back toward the center. The third wave tries to close the distance and set the wood alight. But the sections have been soaked, reinforced, layered with packed earth. Flames sputter and die under counterfire. Those few who reach the wall discover there is nothing to grab. No footholds, no weakness. Defenders stab downward with pikes, fire at point-blank range through widened gaps, smash hands with axe blows to be by the time the sun sinks low. The field in front of the Gulier Gar is carpeted with bodies. 1,000 Tatars dead or dying. Russian losses fewer than 100 up for the horde. This is not just a tactical failure. It is a psychological wound. They camp that night in a wide ring beyond musket range. Campfires stretch across the plain like a second city. But the mood is different now. This was supposed to be easy. This was supposed to end with Moscow burning again. Inside the Gulier Gar, Russian soldiers work without pause. Damaged sections are replaced. Ammunition is redistributed. The wounded are tended in makeshift shelters behind the wall. Vorotensky walks the line quietly, offering no celebration. He knows this was only the beginning. Devlet Giri sits in his command tent, staring at maps illuminated by oil lamps. He has lost men, but he still has overwhelming superiority. He still has Ottoman artillery. He still has janissaries. Tomorrow, he will bring guns. Tomorrow, he will break the wall. The night deepens. The stench of blood drifts across the field. Neither side sleeps. The horde has struck the fortress and bounced. Now the real battle begins. Dawn came under a low ceiling of smoke, the kind that turns the sun into a dull red coin hanging over the steppe. The horde did not move at first. No wild charge, no screaming advance. Instead, there was a grinding sound. Wood and iron dragged over earth. Behind the restless cavalry, heavy Ottoman guns rolled into position, their bronze throats dark and patient. Prince Mikhail Vorotensky watched from behind the timbered spine of the Gulier Gar without speaking. The men around him could feel the shift in the air. Arrows were one thing. This was something else. The first cannon fired, and the world seemed to split. The impact slammed into the wooden wall with a crack like a tree struck by lightning, splinters blasting inward, men thrown off their feet. A second shot followed, then a third, the rhythm steady and merciless. The horde cheered each time the wall shuddered. Smoke thickened, drifting through loopholes and stinging eyes. Inside the mobile fortress, crews dragged damaged panels backward and heaved fresh sections into place, hands blistering, boots slipping in sawdust and blood. Earth packed between double walls swallowed some of the force, but not all. A gunner disappeared in a burst of wood shards. A Streltsy crumpled with his match still burning in his fingers. Hours passed in concussion and dust. Then at last a section bowed inward and split, a jagged mouth opening in the southern line. The cheer that rose from the horde carried even over the cannons. Drums began to beat, slow and deliberate. Through the haze advanced the janissaries, ranked and measured. Muskets leveled, their discipline unnerving after the chaos of Tatar charges. They halted, fired in unison, reloaded as if on a parade ground, and stepped closer to the breach with every volley. Russian defenders along the shattered section fell back step by step, the air between the lines alive with lead and splinters. When the janissaries reached the opening, they expected a broken defense. Instead, they found another wall hastily braced behind a first, and beyond it, ranks of waiting musketeers with glowing cords and pikes angled forward. A shouted signal the Russians fired at point-blank range. The sound was crushing in the confined space. Men in the front rank dropped as if the earth had swallowed them. Still the janissaries pressed, climbing over their fallen, forcing themselves into the narrow gap where pikes stabbed and axes rose and fell. For a few savage minutes, it was not a battle, but a struggle of bodies jammed together, faces inches apart, powder flashes lighting eyes wide with fury and fear. Behind them, the Ottoman guns continued to pound, widening the splintered opening. For a heartbeat, it seemed the line might truly collapse. Tatar cavalry surged forward to exploit the weakness, only to find the ground near the river soft and treacherous. Horses bogged down. Formation tangued. Russian cannons, already sighted on that approach, fired grapeshot at murderous range. The blast scythed through men and animals alike, turning momentum into carnage. The charge faltered, then recoiled at it. Was at that moment that the forest to the flank came alive. From the trees burst Russian cavalry under Prince Dmitry Kvorostinin. Lances lowered, banners snapping in the wind. They did not strike the front. They drove straight into the rear, where supply carts, spare horses, and artillery teams clustered. Gunners abandoned their pieces. Wagons overturned. Smoke from burning carts began to mix with the lingering powder haze. Shouts turned from commands to warnings, from warnings to panic. Devlet Jiri saw the shape of it too late. What he had thought a battered anvil was a trap built to hold him in place. Now the hammer had fallen behind him. The janissaries, still locked in brutal fighting at the breach, found their support dissolving. Orders struggled to carry across the chaos. Tatar units began to pull back to protect the rear, then to withdraw entirely. Withdrawal became confusion. Confusion became flight. The steady drumbeat that had marked the advance faltered and stopped. Inside the Gulier Gar, Voritinsky sensed the shift. He gave the order, and the gates opened. Russian infantry and cavalry surged out together, muskets firing as they advanced, pikes driving forward into men who moments earlier had believed victory within reach. The breach that had nearly doomed them became a doorway for counterattack. The horde, so immense at dawn, began to fracture into scattered knots of resistance and long, wavering lines of retreat. By sunset, the field was unrecognizable, churned mud and broken wheels and bodies lying in grim rows before the battered wooden walls. The horde that had seemed an endless tide now streamed southward in desperate motion, banners lowered, discipline unraveling with every mile. Devlet Jiri ordered the retreat to become general, saving what he could of his army, but the illusion of inevitability was gone. The Gulier Gar still stood, scarred and smoking against the red light of evening, and behind it the Russian army, bloodied but unbroken, stepped out onto the field not as prey but as victors. The retreat began in order, at least in appearance. Standards dipped and turned south. Drums beat the signal to withdraw, and messengers rode hard along the collapsing line, shouting commands meant to preserve dignity. But once movement started, it became impossible to control. The ground was already torn to ruin by hooves and wheels, slick with blood and churned into ruts that caught axles and snapped spokes. Carts overturned. Riderless horses bolted through fleeing ranks. Somewhere in the smoke, an ammunition wagon caught fire and burst with a flat, rolling boom that rippled panic outward like a stone thrown into water. Devlet Giri tried to rally what he could, pulling surviving banners around him, forming a protective ring of loyal retainers and hardened cavalry. He understood the danger now was not just defeat but annihilation. If the Russians broke through cleanly and severed the road south, the entire army could dissolve into the marshes and forests, hunted down in fragments. He ordered the janissaries to disengage in disciplined blocks, covering the retreat, firing controlled volleys whenever Russian cavalry pressed too close. Even in chaos, their training held, and more than once their steady musket fire forced Russian riders to wheel away and regroup. But the Russians did not relent. The gates of the Gulier Gar stood open behind them like the mouth of some wooden beast that had finished devouring its prey. Cavalry poured out in waves, spreading across the plain, cutting off stragglers, driving wedges between retreating units. Musketeers advanced in staggered lines, firing and reloading as they moved, the smoke trailing behind them in long gray ribbons. Every time the horde tried to reform, a fresh Russian push struck a flank or rear, unraveling the effort. The pursuit stretched for miles. What had begun as a battlefield became a running slaughter across open steppe. Tatar riders, masters of maneuver in open country, now found themselves exhausted and harried, their horses blown from 2 days of constant movement. Russian cavalry, rotating mounts and fueled by the surge of victory, pressed harder with each passing hour. Small bands of Tatars turned to fight, buying time for their comrades, and were swallowed by converging lances. Others cast aside shields and bows to ride lighter and faster, abandoning the field entirely. Near the southern approaches, the retreat nearly collapsed into catastrophe. A sudden Russian thrust punched through a thinning guard, and for a brief, electric moment, the Khan's own position was exposed. Arrows and musket balls snapped through the air. Several of his closest guards fell within arm's reach. One Russian rider broke, dangerously close, before being dragged from the saddle. The possibility hung there, sharp and unreal, that the campaign might end not just in defeat, but in the capture of the Crimean ruler himself. Only a desperate countercharge by his remaining retainers carved out enough space for him to escape, spurring southward with what remained of his command. By the time darkness began to gather, the horde was no longer an army, but a scattering of columns racing for safety. Fires burned on the horizon where abandoned wagons smoldered. The plain behind them was silent except for the low moans of the wounded and the distant shouts of Russian patrols finishing grim work in the fading light. When the Russians finally halted, it was not because the enemy had reformed, but because there was little left to chase. The scale of what had happened settled slowly over the field. An invasion force that had threatened Moscow itself had been stopped, broken, and driven back. The wooden walls that had seemed fragile against cannon fire had held long enough to turn the tide. Discipline and preparation had crushed momentum and numbers in the days that followed. The full weight of the defeat became clear. Thousands had fallen. The aura of inevitability that had surrounded Crimean raids for decades was shattered. Word would travel north and west that the steppe tide could be resisted, that firepower and fortification could blunt even the most feared cavalry host. And as the battered remnants of the horde crossed back toward the southern steppes, they carried with them more than losses. They carried the knowledge that the frontier had changed, and that the balance of power in Eastern Europe had shifted in a single, brutal week of smoke and blood. When the pursuit finally slowed and Russian horns signaled recall, the plain did not erupt in cheers. It exhaled. Men who had been running, firing, shouting for 2 days straight simply stopped where they stood. Some dropped to their knees. Some leaned on blood-slick pikes. Some stared southward at the thinning dust of the retreating horde as if expecting it to surge back at any moment. It didn't. The steppe, which had thundered under 100,000 hooves, grew eerily quiet. The GULIER GAR still stood in the distance, crooked and battered, panels shattered, wheels splintered, sections blackened by cannon fire. It no longer looked invincible. It looked exhausted, like the men who had defended it. But it had held, and because it had held, everything else had followed. Russian cavalry rode cautiously over the ground where the Janissaries had tried to break through. The breach was clogged with bodies. Broken muskets lay tangled with snapped pikes powder. Smoke still clung low in the humid air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and trampled earth. Crows had already begun to circle. Officers began taking stock. Units were counted. Ammunition tallied. Wounded carried back behind the wooden walls that had saved them. There was no wild celebration, only a heavy, dawning realization. They had not merely repelled a raid. They had stopped an invasion designed to end them. Far to the south, the retreating forces of deadliest rode in strained silence. The withdrawal was no longer chaotic, but it was stripped of confidence. Survivors glanced back more than once, half expecting Russian cavalry to crest the horizon again. The memory of grape shot tearing through massed riders, of muskets firing from walls that seemed to regenerate, would not fade quickly. The Khan himself understood the scale of it. He had come north not merely to plunder, but to break Moscow's spine, to repeat the burning of the previous year and cement dominance. He had brought Ottoman guns and elite infantry to ensure it. Instead, he rode home diminished, and word travels faster than armies. Riders were already spreading news along the southern frontier settlements. The horde had been stopped, not delayed, not diverted, broken to in Moscow. When confirmation reached the court of Ivan IV, the reaction was not immediate jubilation. It was something deeper, relief edged with disbelief. Only a year earlier, flames had devoured the capital. Now the same enemy had been crushed in open field. The message was unmistakable. Russia could bleed and still stand on the frontier villages that had once braced every summer for smoke on the horizon. The psychological shift began almost immediately. The horde was still dangerous. The steppe was still vast. But the idea of inevitability, that raids were unstoppable, that cavalry supremacy could not be checked, had cracked. Back at Molody, night fell again over the battered field. Fires burned low inside the GULIER GAR as repairs continued, even in victory. Guards remained posted. No one assumed the danger had vanished. But something invisible had changed for the first time in generations. The southern horizon did not feel like a doorway for invasion. It felt like a boundary. And boundaries, once proven defensible, tend to move. The road south was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. What remained of the Crimean host moved and stretched, weary columns across the open steppe, banners torn, armor dented, horses limping from exhaustion. No songs rode the wind now. No boasts, only the creak of leather and the low murmur of men who had seen something they did not expect to see. Fear in their own ranks. They had faced fortified cities before. They had burned them. They had scattered armies in open pursuit. But at Molody they had met something new, a defense that moved, absorbed impact, and struck back with calculated violence. The memory of grape shot tearing lanes through charging cavalry lingered in every rider's mind. So did the image of Janissaries, the Sultan's elite, falling in heaps at a wooden wall. When they crossed back into familiar southern lands, the silence followed them. News preceded them, carried by scattered survivors and traitors who had skirted the battlefield. Whispers hardened into fact. The northern campaign had failed. The Russians had not broken. The horde had in Moscow. The atmosphere was different. The city still bore scars from the fire of the previous year, but this time the bells rang for survival, not mourning. Messengers reported that the army had held under artillery, that the Ottoman-backed assault had collapsed, that the Khan himself had barely escaped encirclement. It was more than a battlefield victory. It was proof that the frontier could be mastered. Ivan IV understood the significance. He had ruled through brutality and suspicion, through opportunity and internal purges. But Molody offered something his reign desperately needed: stability. The southern border, long a bleeding wound, could now be fortified with confidence rather than desperation. Construction accelerated. Defensive lines deepened. Settlements crept farther into contested land under stronger protection. The concept of the mobile fortress, the GULIER GAR, was studied, refined, and integrated into doctrine. What had saved them once would be prepared again. Meanwhile, in the Crimean court, calculation replaced certainty. Devlet Giry had built his reputation on dominance over the northern plains. Now he had to account for a campaign that ended not in tribute and smoke, but in retreat and heavy loss. The psychological edge, the expectation that Moscow would burn when pressed hard enough, had dulled. Raids would continue in years to come. The steppe did not suddenly become safe, but they would no longer carry the same aura of inevitability. Every commander riding north would now remember Molody, the walls that appeared in open field, the hidden cavalry in the forest, the thunder of cannons turned against them. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible. Trade routes grew steadier. Frontier villages rebuilt with less panic. Military reforms emphasized coordination between infantry, artillery, and cavalry rather than reliance on sheer mass or speed. The Russian state, still harsh and often unstable internally, gained breathing room externally. Molody did not end conflict in the region, but it ended an era. For more than a century, the steppe had dictated terms to the forest. After Molody, the forest began answering back, not with desperation, but with structure, planning, and firepower. And history rarely reverses such momentum once it begins. The smoke from the battlefield had barely cleared when the lessons began to sink in. The steppe, once a theater of terror for Russian princes, now looked different. Every commander, every soldier who had survived Molody carried the memory of wooden walls that moved, of musket fire that cut through the air like lightning, and of cavalry swept aside by discipline and planning. The horde had been feared for centuries, yet now, whispers of invincibility began to falter. In Moscow, Ivan IV did not celebrate in the usual ostentatious way. He walked the streets quietly, observing the people, the soldiers, the blackened ruins of suburbs that had been rebuilt in haste. Victory was never a simple thing for him. He knew the power of fear, and now he understood the power of awe, the awe inspired by an enemy crushed not through sheer numbers, but through ingenuity. He convened his generals, his most trusted men, in the dim light of the Kremlin chambers. Maps were unrolled, diagrams of the battlefield traced with fingers. Every move, every tactic, every failure of the horde was studied. The GULIER GAR would no longer be a one-time miracle. It would be a symbol, a doctrine. Prince Vorotensky, weary yet unbowed, stood before the Tsar. "We have proven that discipline can withstand terror, Your Majesty," he said. "But the horde will return if we do not prepare. This is only the beginning." Ivan nodded, his pale eyes sharp with understanding. Russia had survived not just because of walls and guns, but because men were willing to fight with cold calculation, to sacrifice without hesitation, to trust in strategy over instinct. News spread across the territories, from Novgorod to the Volga, from Kazan to the western forests. The northern and eastern principalities felt a shift in the wind. Where before the mention of Tartar raids caused panic, now it stirred determination. Towns reinforced their defenses. Local militias trained with muskets, and the memory of Molody became a story told in hushed, reverent tones. A story of fear turned on its head, a lesson in survival through cleverness rather than submission. Even Devlet Giry could not ignore the impact. Reports from his scouts spoke not only of losses, but of a new kind of enemy, one who refused to panic, who used technology and terrain in ways the horde had never faced. His pride burned, but experience forced him to admit it. The North was no longer a field to dominate without risk. Retreat became a bitter necessity, a lesson he would carry, though would never soften the blow to his reputation among his nobles. Back in Moscow, Ivan IV ordered further innovations. Artillery depots expanded, cavalry units trained to coordinate with infantry, and the GULIER GAR design was adapted for rapid deployment in multiple theaters. It was no longer just a trap. It was a tool of empire. The northern forests, the southern steppe, even the borderlands along the rivers were surveyed for terrain where such fortifications could decide the fate of future battles. Victory at Molody was no longer merely survival. It was transformation. But the Tsar also understood the human cost. Thousands had died in the defense, and their names would not be sung in grand cathedrals. He walked among the survivors quietly, inspecting wounds, offering words of encouragement, and ensuring that those who had faced death without flinching were honored with both material reward and the quiet respect that only Ivan IV could dispense. This was governance through fear, transformed into governance through acknowledgement, a subtle but potent shift in the psyche of a nation. Even as Moscow rebuilt, the shadow of the Horde remained, a reminder that the victory, however brilliant, was fragile. Intelligence networks expanded. Spies were dispatched into Crimea and the surrounding steppe, and scouts trained to read not just the terrain, but the moods of distant enemies. The war had been more than a battle. It had been a lesson in the evolution of strategy, a demonstration that the North could fight back and fight smart against forces that had once seemed unstoppable. Russia had survived, yes, but it had also learned to anticipate, to innovate, and to wield fear as a tool rather than a weapon against it. Molody became more than a battle. It became a turning point. And as Ivan IV stared out over the rebuilding city, he knew that the world beyond the Kremlin walls would never underestimate the terrible Tsar again. The stage was set for a new era, one of cautious power, strategic brilliance, and the constant reminder that discipline, ingenuity, and fearlessness could shape empires. The aftermath of Molody rippled far beyond Moscow. Villages that once trembled at the thought of Tartar raids now trained local militias, digging ditches, building wooden walls, and drilling with muskets. Merchants traveled with more confidence, knowing that even the wild steppes were no longer entirely beyond control. Ivan IV, walking the corridors of the Kremlin, felt the subtle shift in the air. Respect, fear, and curiosity intermingled wherever his envoys went. He was no longer merely a ruler of Moscow. He was the architect of a northern power that could face the steppe without flinching. Diplomacy became as much a weapon as cannons. Ambassadors carried stories of Molody into the courts of Poland, Lithuania, and even the Ottoman Empire, spreading the tale of a Russia that had stared down the Horde and survived. Some dismissed it as propaganda, others whispered unease. Ivan did not care which, so long as the image of a terrible Tsar reached every border. His generals continued to refine tactics, creating manuals and diagrams that would train soldiers for years, embedding the lessons of Molody into the very culture of Russian warfare. Even Devlet Giri could feel the shift. Reports from spies reached him of fortified towns, prepared soldiers, and a Tsar who no longer relied on mere numbers to win. Retreat was bitter, but he recognized a new reality. The North was not a playground for easy conquest. The Horde still commanded fear elsewhere, but here, along the forests and rivers of Muscovy, the game had changed. And while pride burned in his chest, he had to respect the cunning and discipline that had turned a simple battle into a lesson in survival and strategy. Within Russia, Ivan IV used Molody's memory to tighten internal control. He rewarded commanders and soldiers who had performed with distinction, but he also reminded them that discipline, loyalty, and foresight were valued above brute courage. Towns along the southern borders were transformed into miniature fortresses, each designed to slow any invader while allowing local forces to strike with precision. Technology was embraced wherever it could aid defense. Artillery, fortified walls, and coordinated infantry became standard. Molody was no longer a story of luck. It was a blueprint for a nation learning to survive and dominate. Culturally, the story of the battle wove into songs, chronicles, and lessons taught in monasteries and schools. Children learned the names of heroes, generals, and ordinary soldiers who had faced death without hesitation. Moscow's citizens, once accustomed to fearing the steppe, now spoke of it with cautious pride. They were not conquerors yet, but they were no longer merely prey. The shadow of Molody stretched far into the imagination of the people, forging resilience where once there had been dread. Even in the years that followed, spies, scouts, and intelligence networks flourished. Rivers were patrolled, forests scouted, and any hint of horde movement was analyzed with precision. Ivan IV had learned that survival required foresight, and he instilled that lesson across every level of his command. Every peasant, soldier, and noble came to understand that Russia's strength was no longer in numbers alone, but in strategy, preparation, and a willingness to face fear with clarity. By the time winter set in, Moscow was alive with rebuilding and planning. Gunsmiths and carpenters worked side by side, reinforcing the lessons of Molody into every town and village. Soldiers drilled relentlessly, and Ivan IV watched over it all, a silent sentinel whose eyes measured both loyalty and capability. He had faced death himself, seen his people face it, and survived. The northern lands were no longer vulnerable. They were ready, and in that readiness lay a warning. Molody had been a beginning, not an end. The Tsar, the generals, and the people all knew that the steppe would stir again. But now, Muscovy had learned a simple truth. Fear could be turned into power, caution into strategy, and a single battle into the foundation of a nation. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the world beyond the forests and rivers would have to reckon with a Russia reborn from fire, blood, and cunning. Winter melted into spring, and the land around Moscow buzzed with more than reconstruction. Ivan IV did not allow Molody to fade into legend. He used it as leverage. Ambassadors carried tales of Russian resilience to the courts of Lithuania, Poland, and even Sweden, reminding them that Muscovy was no longer a passive northern kingdom. Scouts reported movements along the western frontiers, and Ivan seized on any sign of hesitation in neighboring states. Every small border skirmish, every reinforced town, sent a clear message. Russia would defend itself, and it would retaliate if challenged. Merchants, too, became unwitting diplomats. Caravans braved longer routes into Eastern Europe, carrying not just goods, but whispers of a Muscovy that had stared down the horde and survived. Tales of Molody reached taverns and palaces alike. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, but those who knew the steppe feared the message. This was a state tempered by fire, disciplined in war, and led by a czar who calculated every move. Fear was now as much a weapon as sword or cannon. Within the military, Ivan IV's reforms took root. Fortifications along the western and southern borders expanded, muskets and artillery became standardized, and garrisons were trained in coordinated maneuvers. Officers drilled their men not just to fight, but to anticipate, deceive, and dominate. Every river crossing, every forest edge, every open plain became a lesson in strategy. Molody was no longer a memory. It was doctrine, etched into the minds of soldiers who had once fled at the mere whisper of Tartar raids. Neighboring rulers watched with unease. Devlet Giry could only grumble as reports reached him of Russian patrols probing deeper into the steppe, of fortified towns that seemed impossible to take, and of envoys who spoke of a Muscovy reborn. Poland and Lithuania shuffled alliances nervously, realizing that the northern state was no longer to be underestimated. Ivan IV, meanwhile, played every encounter with precision. Some threats were fended with diplomacy, others with military shows of force, but all reinforced the idea that Russia had learned its lessons well. Even the Russian people felt the shift. Farmers and tradesmen along the borders spoke of soldiers drilling at sunrise, of new walls, of patrols moving silently through forests. Moscow itself thrummed with confidence. Citizens no longer whispered fearfully of Tartar raids. They discussed strategy, honor, and the rising reputation of their czar. Stories of Molody were repeated in taverns and marketplaces, not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence that Muscovy had the courage, cunning, and discipline to defend itself and expand its influence by the end of that year. Russia had begun to assert itself, carefully, deliberately, testing the patience of neighbors without inviting full-scale war. Every skirmish along the borders, every fortified town, every well-trained regiment sent the same message. Muscovy had survived the steppe, and now it demanded respect. Molodi's shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield. It was the psychological edge that reshaped diplomacy, trade, and war in Eastern Europe. The Tsar, watching from the Kremlin, understood one unshakable truth. Fear, when mastered, could be a tool. And as scouts returned with news of distant movements and diplomats whispered of hesitation in foreign courts, Ivan IV smiled slightly, knowing that Molodi was not just a battle one. It was a foundation for a Russia that would not merely survive, but assert its power across lands that once seemed beyond reach. Spring turned into a restless summer, and Ivan IV began to test the strength of Muscovy's new resolve. Small detachments of cavalry rode along the western and southern frontiers, not to conquer, but to probe, to see which towns were weak, which alliances were shaky, and which rulers hesitated. Some raids were carefully timed, striking at lightly defended villages, sending homeward whispers of Russian audacity. The aim wasn't destruction for its own sake. It was a message. Muscovy had the courage, the strategy, and the discipline to strike, and those who underestimated it would pay attention. Diplomacy moved alongside the raids. Ambassadors carried gifts and threats in equal measure, recounting tales of Molodi with the precision of a historian and the flair of a storyteller. Poland, Lithuania, and the Crimean Khanate watched nervously. Every envoy returned with subtle signs that neighbors were reconsidering old assumptions. Muscovy's reputation was no longer confined to its borders. It had become a force in the calculations of kings and khans. Meanwhile, Ivan IV expanded his military reach. Muskets were distributed to frontier garrisons. Artillery reinforced fortresses, and scouts charted every river, forest, and plain. Orders were precise. Soldiers were to strike quickly, gather intelligence, and withdraw before overextension could become dangerous. Molodi had taught Muscovy that careful planning could turn the tide against even the most formidable opponent. Soldiers trained in its memory, memorizing lessons in ambushes, terrain advantage, and timing. News of these maneuvers traveled fast. Traders spoke of lightly raided villages and disciplined Russian detachments that left no chaos behind, only fear and respect. Foreign merchants and spies noted the precision. Muscovy was no longer reactive. It was proactive. The stories of Molodi became tools of psychological warfare, whispered in courts and taverns, reinforcing the idea that Russia was tempered by battle and ready to shape its own destiny by the end of the campaign season. The borders had shifted subtly, not in miles, but in perception. Neighbors measured Muscovy differently now. Every cautious glance, every fortified town, every envoy's word carried the weight of a state that had faced destruction and emerged stronger. Ivan IV, in the quiet of his chambers, studied maps and reports. Molodi had been the spark, but now the fire was under his control, spreading methodically across lands that once seemed untouchable. After the shockwaves of Molodi had faded, Ivan IV turned his attention inward, determined to transform the lessons of the battlefield into lasting strength. Governors and nobles who had once ignored his commands were reminded, often violently, that Muscovy now answered to a leader who understood both terror and strategy. Towns along the rivers were reinforced, watchtowers rebuilt, and roads cleared for faster communication between Moscow and the frontiers. The once fragmented empire now moved with the precision of a single, disciplined organism, a living testament to the meticulous planning that had turned near certain annihilation into triumph. At the same time, Ivan extended subtle influence outward. Envoys carried veiled warnings and careful praise to neighboring states. The Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and even the remnants of the Crimean aristocracy. Muscovy was no longer merely surviving. It was shaping its image as a state that could not be bullied or easily broken. Small border skirmishes were deliberately orchestrated, each one a lesson in restraint and power. Armies struck fast, gathered intelligence, and withdrew before the enemy could retaliate, leaving only the impression of a force that was both omnipresent and untouchable. Merchants and spies spread stories of the mobile fortresses, of Muscovy's disciplined musketeers, and of villages that had survived raids with minimal loss. These tales traveled faster than any army could march, planting seeds of caution, respect, and even fear in the courts of neighbors. The names of Voritinsky and the GULIER GAR became part of the whispered lore, symbols of an empire that had learned to bend the strength of technology, strategy, and psychological warfare to its will. Meanwhile, Ivan's internal reforms solidified his control. The Streltsy, Muscovy's permanent musketeer regiments, were expanded and drilled in new tactics inspired by Melody. Roads were patrolled by loyal Cossack detachments, ensuring that intelligence could move faster than enemy forces. Spies infiltrated neighboring courts, feeding Ivan the knowledge needed to make preemptive decisions. Every piece of Muscovy's apparatus, from treasury to army, was now a cog in a system designed to prevent the empire from ever being caught off guard again. By the end of this season, Muscovy had become a state that neighbors could no longer ignore. The whispers of Melody were no longer just rumors. They were proof that Russia had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. Ivan watched these developments with a quiet, calculating satisfaction. Victory at Melody had been the catalyst, but what followed, the consolidation of power, the careful intimidation of neighbors, the reshaping of the empire's internal and external structure, was the real triumph. Muscovy was no longer simply defending itself. It was preparing to take its place as a rising power in Eastern Europe, feared, respected, and increasingly unstoppable. With Melody still fresh in memory, Ivan foreknew that hesitation could undo all the advantages generals and soldiers had won. He began sending small, precise expeditions beyond Russia's southern and eastern frontiers, targeting vulnerable border settlements and raiding parties to test defenses. These were not reckless attacks. They were carefully measured, psychological maneuvers meant to remind surrounding powers that Muscovy now struck with precision and discipline, and that no enemy could assume safety simply because they had outnumbered Russian forces in the past. Each expedition brought back captives, intelligence, and sometimes tribute, slowly reversing the centuries-old pattern of Muscovy paying fines and hostages to the steppe Khans. The Crimean Tatars, still licking the wounds of Melody, found themselves facing a Russia that no longer feared their cavalry. Ivan's spies and scouts monitored every movement south, reporting back with almost uncanny speed. Russian forces established fortified outposts along key river crossings, small wooden fortresses inspired by the GULIER GAR concept, allowing them to control territory without committing large armies unnecessarily. The steppe nomads, accustomed to terrorizing loosely defended villages, now encountered prepared defenses and disciplined soldiers who could repel, outmaneuver, and even strike at their supply lines. Ivan also turned his attention to diplomacy. Envoys carried gifts, threats, and ultimatums to neighboring rulers, making clear that Muscovy was not only capable of defending itself, but of dictating terms. The Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, once precarious vassals, were forced into tighter agreements, providing tribute and hostages on terms set by Moscow rather than the other way around. Even the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth began reconsidering its stance toward Muscovy, realizing that the empire that had been burned, pillaged, and humiliated less than a decade earlier had grown into a force that could challenge the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Internally, Ivan ensured that this expansion of influence was matched by reforms at home. The Streltsy were drilled harder, logistics networks improved, and intelligence gathering became systematic rather than opportunistic. Villages along the border were rebuilt and supplied, making them strong points rather than soft targets. The once fractured and demoralized populace now saw themselves as part of a state capable of projecting its power, defending its people, and punishing enemies with efficiency previously unheard of in the region. By the end of this period, Muscovy was no longer the vulnerable, fire-ravaged state of 1571. It was a disciplined, organized, and assertive empire, moving from a defensive posture to one of controlled aggression. The victories and innovations of Mlody had become more than just a battle story. They were the blueprint for a rising power that demanded respect, forged through strategy, discipline, and the unrelenting will of Ivan the Terrible. After the shock of Mlody, Muscovy was no longer a passive player on the edge of the steppe. It had transformed into a state that could dictate terms and enforce them. Ivan IV wasted no time consolidating his gains. The winter of 1572 to 1573 was spent not in mourning the dead, but in planning the next phase of Russia's rise. Engineers and carpenters were dispatched to fortify border towns along the Oka, Don, and Volga rivers. Each settlement was redesigned to serve as a defensive node capable of supporting nearby units, housing troops, storing supplies, and projecting authority. These fortifications were small, efficient, and, crucially, designed with mobility in mind. Wooden walls, towers on wheels, and temporary earthworks allowed troops to rapidly redeploy in response to any Tatar incursion. The Tatars, meanwhile, were struggling to recover. Devlet Jurai had returned to Crimea, but his prestige had been irreparably damaged. For decades, his family had ruled the Crimean Khanate with authority derived not only from military prowess, but from fear. That fear had been shattered at Mlody. Among the Tatars, morale sank lower than it had in generations. Tribal nobles began openly questioning Devlet's leadership. Some plotted to remove him, while others quietly sought alliances elsewhere. The Ottoman Empire, which had backed the Khanate with troops and artillery, realized that Muscovy was no longer a simple target for raids. Diplomats in Constantinople reported that Russia's army had not only survived a full-scale invasion, but had inflicted losses on the Tatars that could not easily be replaced. The balance of power along the northern Black Sea was shifting, and the Sultan had to reconsider how much to invest in Crimea's future campaigns. Culturally, the expansion of Muscovy into the Volga and southern steppes brought new influences. Slavic settlers, merchants, and craftsmen moved into former Khanate lands, blending traditions and skills. Towns became centers of trade and learning, with fortified marketplaces where Russian, Tatar, and even some Ottoman merchants converged. This economic integration ensured that newly acquired territories were profitable, not just strategically valuable, and tied them more tightly to Moscow's political orbit. By the late 1570s, Muscovy had achieved something extraordinary. It was no longer reacting to the steppe, it was shaping it. Ivan IV's careful balance of force, diplomacy, and infrastructure created a buffer zone that not only protected Muscovy, but also allowed it to project power beyond its borders. The Tatars, though still dangerous, were now constrained. Their raids were smaller, their alliances tentative, and their morale fragile. Meanwhile, Russia's reputation as a disciplined, technologically advanced, and ruthless military power spread across Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. Ivan IV himself became a figure both revered and feared. His ability to turn near disaster into a foundation for empire, to combine terror with governance, and to wield diplomacy alongside force marked him as a ruler unlike any the steppe had encountered. His vision for Muscovy was clear. The state would expand, protect its people, and ensure that no enemy, whether Tatar, Ottoman, or Polish, could threaten its borders without paying a heavy price. Every fortified town, trained militia, and river patrol reinforced this vision, creating a network of control that would endure long after Mlody was a memory. The story of this period set the stage for Muscovy's next moves, fully integrating the Volga and steppe regions, building a more permanent army, and preparing for campaigns that would stretch Russia's influence ever further into territories once dominated by the Tatars. Ivan IV had turned a tactical victory into a long-term strategy, one that would echo through Russian history and redefine the relationship between Moscow and the southern steppes for generations. Even after Mlody, Ivan IV knew the steppe was a snake pit, Every Tatar raid, every whispered alliance, every merchant's arrival carried the scent of betrayal. The expansion into the Volga wasn't just about forts and rivers. It was a game of shadows and whispers. Spies infiltrated Khan's courts, bribes and poison mixed with letters of loyalty, and envoys sometimes vanished in the night. When one local noble tried to double-cross Muscovy, promising loyalty while plotting with the Crimean Khanate, Ivan's messengers delivered a chilling message. The traitor's head, displayed on the city gates at dawn, eyes wide in frozen terror, while his family was exiled into the snow. Fear became as vital as the cannon and musket in controlling new lands. But fear alone couldn't hold the southern border. Ivan poured into the steppe his most loyal soldiers, the Streltsy, and a new breed of cavalry that struck like lightning. Ambushes became art. Tatars who thought themselves unseen were suddenly trapped in villages surrounded by fire. One night, a Tatar raiding party of hundreds rode straight into a Muscovite ambush. Fires erupted, arrows rained, and screams echoed over the plains as the survivors were cut down, leaving the bodies like grim warnings for those who dared challenge Moscow. Ivan reveled in these stories, embellishing them in letters and dispatches to nobles and foreign courts. His enemies learned that Melody wasn't a fluke, it was a warning. But Muscovy's victories bred envy at home. The Oprichnina whispered of plots against the Tsar, jealous commanders craving the glory and wealth of the Volga spoils. Ivan, ever paranoid, staged a terrifying display. At a council meeting, he accused a governor of plotting rebellion. Before the stunned assembly, soldiers dragged him out and executed him publicly, his cries echoing through the hall while Ivan calmly sipped wine, letting the lessons sink into the bones of everyone present. Loyalty became survival. Hesitation meant death. Even diplomacy turned into a battlefield of wits. Local Khans offered riches to keep their lands, yet Ivan demanded their loyalty, or else. When one Khan, drunk with overconfidence, mocked the Muscovite envoys, Ivan ordered his palace burned while the Khan's court fled in panic. Soldiers captured the river docks, burning ships and seizing merchants' goods. By the time the Khan realized Moscow's reach, his wealth was gone, his allies terrified, and his territory bleeding under Muscovite control. The Volga towns became dark jewels in Ivan's crown. Markets thrived, but they weren't peaceful. They were under surveillance. Merchants whispered rumors of black-clad Oprichnina moving unseen through the streets, interrogating anyone suspected of disloyalty. Meanwhile, Ivan encouraged settlers from central Russia, giving them lands in exchange for loyalty, turning the conquered territories into a patchwork of new allegiances. But old grudges simmered beneath the surface. Every festival, every trade caravan, every new harvest carried the tension of 1,000 potential betrayals. Yet Muscovy's expansion wasn't without romance, lust, and scandal. Stories spread of soldiers and settlers entangled with local women. Alliances sealed not just with contracts, but with stolen kisses, secret liaisons, and forbidden passions. Some nobles used love as a weapon, seducing enemies' daughters to extract secrets or coercing rivals into betrayals. In the shadow of Ivan IV's campaigns, personal ambition often clashed with loyalty, making the southern frontier not just a war of armies, but a war of hearts and shadows. And through it all, Ivan himself became a living storm. He rode the southern plains in the dead of night, inspecting forts, inspecting troops, and sometimes executing those who failed silently before their comrades. Tales of his cruelty spread faster than his armies. Children would hide in fear, villagers would pray to survive another day, and even allies wondered if Moscow's Tsar was more demon than man. But his vision never wavered. Every bloody steppe, every burned palace, every betrayed noble built Muscovy into a state that no Tatar or foreign power could ignore. Be why the end of this surge south. Muscovy had done more than repel invaders. It had rewritten the rules of the steppe. The Tatars were no longer predators. They were shadows skirting the edges of a rising giant. Moscow's influence spread like wildfire across rivers, plains and towns. And Ivan IV, feared, cunning, and unrelenting, stood at the center, a ruler whose legend would haunt the whispers of soldiers, merchants, and enemies alike for generations. Kazan had always been a thorn in Muscovy's side, a city of golden domes and minarets, proud warriors, and a Khan who believed Moscow was just another fleeting threat. Ivan IV, however, was not a man to underestimate. He studied Kazan's every weakness, its rivers, walls, alliances, and rivalries. He sent envoys under silk banners, speaking of peace, trade, and friendship, while secretly sending spies disguised as merchants, engineers, and even minstrels. Every word, every song, every letter became a tool to unravel the city from within. When the first cannonballs thundered against Kazan's walls, the city was already sown with seeds of fear and betrayal. One influential noble secretly opened the gates for Ivan's forces at night, convinced that survival meant switching sides. Fires lit the skyline, towers collapsed, and the river carried the echoes of battle downstream. Muscovite cavalry stormed the streets, cutting down soldiers and mercenaries, while the Oprichnina hunted anyone who hesitated, their black cloaks flashing like shadows among the ruins. Yet even amidst the carnage, Ivan demanded order. Merchants were allowed to trade under strict supervision. Families not caught in rebellion were spared, and the city's administration was absorbed into Muscovy's machinery. Astrakhan posed a different challenge. Located at the delta of the mighty Volga, its wealth was legendary. Silks, spices, and gold flowed through its ports. The Khanate's rulers were clever, hiring mercenaries from distant lands, and their fleets could challenge Muscovies along the river. But Ivan IV, ever the strategist, played a dangerous game. He spread rumors of a hidden alliance between Kazan and the Crimean Khanate, knowing that fear and mistrust would turn allies against one another. Muscovite ships, sleek and armed with early cannon, cut through Astrakhan's patrols under the cover of fog, while Ivan's cavalry encircled the city from the north. Inside Astrakhan, panic erupted. Nobles accused each other of treason, families hid in cellars, and spies whispered warnings that turned neighbors into enemies. Ivan's soldiers stormed the city gates not with brute force alone, but with psychological warfare. Decoy fires, staged retreats, and sudden assaults left the defenders confused and terrified. By dawn, the Muscovites controlled the main forts, and the river traffic was under strict inspection. Every ship docking paid tribute. Every merchant swore allegiance. And Ivan's reach extended further into the steppe than any Russian ruler had dared. But conquest came with shadows. Even Ivan IV, feared and relentless, could not predict every betrayal. One night, a trusted general plotted to seize the spoils of Astrakhan for himself. Ivan, learning of the scheme through a network of spies, confronted him before the general's tent. With cold precision, he executed the traitor, letting his body swing as a warning beneath the crescent moon. Soldiers whispered of Ivan's eyes, describing them as cold fires that saw every lie, every ambition, every heartbeat. Loyalty became a life-or-death gamble. Hesitation meant disappearance. Even as Muscovy grew in power, rumors of rebellion and foreign plots never ceased. Tatars, Crimeans, and even distant Persian agents whispered in every market and caravan. Ivan, however, turned fear into art. He hosted banquets where spies mingled with nobles, exchanged coded words, and left with new loyalties or a new fear of crossing the Tsar. The Volga's cities, once free and defiant, became a network of controlled wealth, disciplined armies, and silent obedience, all stitched together by strategy, fire, and an iron will be why the time Ivan IV finished consolidating Kazan and Astrakhan. Muscovy was no longer just a Russian principality. It was an empire forging its destiny in blood, fire, and steel. And at its center, Ivan stood, feared, legendary, unstoppable, a ruler whose shadow stretched across the steppe, a man whose ambition could bend rivers, topple cities, and rewrite history itself. The Volga had never known such a storm. from the frozen northern forest to the delta where rivers bled into the Caspian. Ivan IV's shadow now stretched farther than anyone dared imagine. Kazan and Astrakhan were under his grip, yet the work was far from over. Every city, every fortress, every merchant and noble carried secrets, rivalries, and grudges that could ignite into rebellion if mishandled. Ivan knew this, and he embraced the knowledge with the cold precision of a predator circling prey. The first task was securing loyalty. In Kazan, the streets whispered with fear and curiosity. Once proud Tatar nobles now served as advisors under Ivan's strict supervision. Their words carefully chosen, their movements watched. The Tsar summoned them to the Kremlin in Moscow, forcing them to walk through miles of guarded streets, past citizens who stared silently, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. At the palace, Ivan's table was set with gold and silver dishes, yet the air carried a deadly tension. One wrong glance, one hesitation in answering a question could mean exile or death. Each noble learned quickly that Muscovy demanded not just allegiance, but complete submission. Astrakhan, with its labyrinthine streets and bustling port, posed an even trickier problem. Trade flowed like a river through the city, carrying silk, spices, and gold that could fund armies or bribe rivals. Ivan sent his agents disguised as merchants, dock workers, and even entertainers. They observed the city, cataloged every alley, every secret passage, and every suspicious trader. Nightly reports detailed minor rebellions, plots, and whispers of defiance. To keep control, Ivan implemented a strict surveillance network. Guards disguised as locals walked the streets, while informants embedded in every guild and marketplace reported even the smallest infraction. Fear became an invisible wall around Astrakhan, one more effective than stone or cannon. But fear alone was never enough for Ivan. He needed to remind his subjects and enemies that defiance carried consequences. One evening, a caravan of suspected rebels tried to escape to the Caspian. Ivan ordered the pursuit personally. Soldiers rode like shadows, their hooves silent against the frozen earth until they surrounded the fugitives. Captured, the rebels were brought to the central square. There, Ivan demanded loyalty one final time. When they hesitated, his guards executed them in full view, their bodies a brutal warning to all who might consider treason. Yet he allowed merchants who had stayed loyal to continue trading, proving that obedience could still yield profit and survival late night. Ivan's mind never rested. In his chambers, maps sprawled across tables, pins marking cities, rivers, and potential threats. Messages from spies arrived continuously, describing plots, alliances, and the mood of the people. Ivan read each word carefully, memorized each detail, and planned his next move with ruthless clarity. He did not simply conquer. He orchestrated, manipulating cities and people like pieces on a board. Foreign powers began to take notice. The Crimean Khanate, Persia, and even distant Ottoman spies sent envoys to test Ivan's strength. He met each with a mix of charm and intimidation. Banquets filled with gold and silk, gifts laced with subtle threats, and veiled warnings that Muscovy's reach was now far beyond what anyone had dared to imagine. Some envoys left convinced of Ivan's power, others terrified, plotting in secret but never daring to act openly. Within Muscovy, Ivan's rule deepened its iron grip. The Oprichnina patrolled every major city, their black cloaks and mounted cavalry a living reminder that loyalty was not optional. Nobles who once thought themselves untouchable learned that ambition alone could be deadly. One minor noble, attempting to gather support against the Tsar, found himself humiliated publicly, his land seized, his family imprisoned, and his name erased from all records. Rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass. Ivan saw all, knew all, and punished without hesitation. Yet Ivan's brilliance was not just in terror. It was in construction and consolidation. He rebuilt Kazan's walls, fortified Astrakhan's ports, and reorganized both cities' militias under Muscovy's command. Roads were repaired to allow rapid troop movement, rivers patrolled to prevent smuggling, and bridges controlled to ensure no rebellion could escape. Administrators loyal to Moscow replaced corrupt or treacherous leaders. Yet Ivan left enough autonomy that the cities could function smoothly. This delicate balance of fear and governance became the hallmark of his reign. Even as Muscovy expanded, Ivan's personal reputation grew into legend. Tales of his ruthlessness spread to distant lands. He executed traitors with unmatched precision, rewarded loyalty with gold and positions of power, and played spies, nobles, and even merchants against one another to ensure he remained the undisputed center of control. Yet behind the fearsome exterior, Ivan harbored a mind constantly calculating the next move, the next conquest, the next alliance, the next step in turning Muscovy into an empire that would be remembered for centuries. That'd be why the end of this campaign. The Volga was no longer a river of independent city-states and khanates. It was a lifeline for a rising empire. Muscovy's armies dominated the steppe. Its cities hummed with controlled wealth and vigilance. And Ivan IV stood at the pinnacle of power, feared, respected, and unstoppable. Yet even as he gazed across the lands he had conquered, Ivan knew that ambition was never satisfied. The world beyond the Volga still held challenges, and a ruler like him never rested. Not while there were lands to bend, enemies to outwit, and history to rewrite in his image.